the more that you understand your business and the customer and the market, and the more that you have like metrics that are working, the easier it'll be. If some of those pieces are kind of a little bit murky, then it's going to be hard. And I think each of our fundraisers was kind of hard for different reasons. I think our Series A was kind of hard because we didn't quite understand how the market was gonna coalesce, and we had the fans and believers who could kind of squint at it with us. And Series B was kind of hard because we were at a point where like the business is growing, but it wasn't growing like gangbusters. It was just like growing nicely. So it was like finding the right investor who wanted to invest in us at that stage.
My name is Kevin David, and if you want real financial freedom for yourselves and for your loved ones today, then the time is now. And I will be there to help you every step of the way.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to another exciting episode of your favorite podcast, or soon-to-be favorite podcast, The Kevin David Experience. Today, we have a very special guest. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give a big shout-out to all of you guys who are leaving us reviews on iTunes. And an even bigger shout-out to you guys who are sharing the podcast, even with just one friend. Most people don't do it, but if you do, it really does help the podcast grow and reach more amazing people like you. So today we have Brian Rue joining us from San Francisco, the Bay Area. And so the first question that we ask everybody, Brian, is to describe your entrepreneurial journey all the way up till right now in 60 seconds or less.
All right. So I grew up in Seattle. I was first introduced to code when I was 6 and built number games. Ever since then, I've been using code to build things. Ended up at Stanford, was there for a couple of years, left to start my first company, grew to about 100 million users on Facebook, learned lots of things about how to build software quickly and how to deliver crazy experiences to users. Then I took those ideas, kind of inspired Rollbar, and the mission with Rollbar has been about helping developers to build software as fast as possible, and really just kind of think of it as having a direct connection between your keyboard and the user. And I've been working on Rollbar for about 9 years. Today, we're a team in San Francisco and helping thousands of developers all around the world to go as fast as they possibly can.
Nice. I like it. I like how you like sped up your voice to like hit that 60-second requirement.
You give me a deadline, man. I'm going to go for it.
I know. I like that. So I like, there's a casual 100 million users dropped in there. So can you give some backstory about what that was, how you grew it to 100 million users and what ended up happening with it?
Yeah, so in beginning of 2008, Facebook had just launched their app platform, and they had a bunch of viral channels on it, where basically anyone could build an app that if you kind of use the viral channels the right way, so things like the profile, the feed, invites, you could get people to send out your application and share it with people pretty rapidly. And it's kind of the early days of understanding how virality worked on the internet. And it had been studied before then somewhat, kind of through email, but Facebook really took that up about 10 notches. And there were a bunch of developers at the time that figured out how to use those channels to spread things really, really quickly. And at my company, Lolapps, we figured that out. And within about 6 months, we were at tens of millions. I think it got to about 100 million users. So it's pretty nuts.
That's crazy. So like those viral channels, right? Because I mean, that's kind of like the holy grail of viral coefficients, being able to reach a lot of people and things like that. The days of that happening on Facebook, at least through like the primary channels, are probably behind us for the most part. Yeah. Do you see any like new inklings? I mean, I was talking to I had a gentleman on my podcast who was the head of growth at Facebook and then at Uber. And he was talking about how kind of like the mobile address book is something that he's been excited with, how apps like Clubhouse have kind of used that really like effectively, showing you how many other friends that you have like on the app and things like that. In your experience, like are there any new or potentially new viral channels like that have piqued your interest, or do you see that any of them coming up, or how do you stay aware of potential new channels, how Facebook was back in 2008?
I think anytime there's a new social network and a new like kind of way people are gathering together online, that's an opportunity to kind of think through like what are the ways that might be there. I mean, some examples would be things like GitHub is a great, the kind of the equivalent for developers. It doesn't have the same kind of channels as Facebook did, but there definitely are mechanics there. Though I don't know that we've quite seen anything quite like the Facebook platform in 2008. I think the next one of those is still out in the future.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so like, when because a lot of my audience are entrepreneurs, beginner entrepreneurs, more advanced entrepreneurs. For people who are not like technical, where would you like specifically suggest finding talented engineers? Like what what forums, what websites, if, and I know there's probably not like a hack to it, but I mean, what would be like the things that you've learned over the years as a talented engineer to find other potential talented engineers? Like, where do they hang out? Where should you look for them?
I think the way to find the best talented engineers, if you're not technical, is to have a really strong understanding of what your idea is, in particular your customer. Right? I think like there's lots of great engineers that want to work on something interesting, but don't really have, they'd rather be spending their time with the code than with the user. And if you're someone who, understands the user really deeply, then like finding that partner is like, that's the way to do it. But I think you got to view it as a partnership, right? Like no great engineer wants to be like your code monkey, right? Like they want to be working on like interesting things. They want to be solving the problems with you. So I think thinking of it as a partnership, I think is the key.
Yeah. And how do you specifically, how do you make it a partnership? Do you give them like equity, and like how much do you give new talented engineers that come on at different stages? Like for people who don't have as much experience as you starting companies, like specifically, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, how do you make anything a partnership, right? Like it starts with like you have shared goals, you have respect, you have trust, and then out of that flows, I think you talked about, right, the mechanics of like, sure, you're probably gonna split equity. You're going to have a mutual agreement around how long you're gonna work together. You're gonna divide up the work and have a good relationship where you give and take, right? I think it's just about genuinely being a team and genuinely being a partner.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And when you're recruiting for Rollbar and for your companies, like how do you do that? Do you do that mainly through like friends and like referrals, or do you look like on the Stanford campus where you went, or how do you go about that?
Yeah, when Rollbar first started, it was all about like people that I knew, right? So my co-founder wasn't one of the first engineers at my first company. The first engineer we hired was one of the later engineers at that company, and I think that's that's the way that I think it's a great way to get started, right? Like as we kind of later on, we kind of would recruit from wider and wider parts of the network, and eventually became about bringing in recruiting. And Rollbar, we were fortunate to work with a great recruiter who really kind of gave us that ability to say, hey, like we need to fill a role, we can just fill it. And when you can get to a point where you can do that, it really changes the way you can think about how you build your team.
Yeah, something that I've struggled with is, I talk to and meet a lot of like really promising seeming engineers, right? Like people who have, who are great to be around, they seem awesome. But the problem that I have, and I actually get this question a lot from my listeners, is how do you evaluate like the ultimate strength of like an engineer or a technical, coding style person if you're non-technical yourself?
I think that is one of the great mysteries in life. I don't have a great answer there, but I do think like it comes like if you're both aligned in trying to solve a particular problem and trying to serve the needs of a particular user or customer, then you can measure all the efforts you're doing in terms of that, right? So are you chipping away at solving the problem you need to solve? Are you chipping away at building the product you need to build? Are you improving it on an iterative basis and a frequent basis? I think like one of the signs that it's maybe not, at least like not the right kind of fit for me would be someone that wants to kind of like sit in the room for a year and come out and be like, trust me, a year from now, I'll have this fixed. I think it's too hard to predict that far ahead, right? And you've got to, I think a much better way to build things is, whether it's code or a business or a relationship or whatever, is in small chunks, right? Do it like a week at a time, 2 weeks at a time. I think that's so much easier to see how it's progressing, and ultimately works a lot better.
Yeah, no, I agree. And when you hire like a new engineer outside of your direct network, are you giving them like technical style interview questions where you're like, writing things on whiteboards, kind of like how Google made famous? Or like, how do you go about actually like hiring, new tech? You have the advantage of being technical yourself, but, for someone who isn't, like, how would you suggest going about that? Do you actually do technical interviews, or do you, because the technical stuff yourself so well that you can kind of tell? Because like, for example, like when I hire like a digital marketer or something that I know like as well as anyone in the world, it's quite obvious to tell who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't from like a deep conversation. But with like technical and with coding stuff, do you actually have them like do it in front of you, or like how important is it to you that somebody's like, already built things in their past and they can show you things that they've already done?
So if you were to hire like a chef, right, or maybe like someone to work in your kitchen, you might ask them to like, hey, can you like chop an onion, right? It's similar with coding, right? Like if the thing you're gonna be doing every day is writing code, then I think it's totally fair to be like, hey, can you like write some code for me, right? And talk about it. I think if you're not an engineer, I think you can still do that and just be like, hey, like talk me through this, right? Like do something simple, explain how it works. We're gonna work together, and there's gonna be times when you're gonna get stuck, and like maybe just like talking to the rubber duck is gonna help you fix it. Like I think trialing that relationship is I think is a great way to start.
Yeah. And one of the questions that I had from the audience that people wanted me to ask you, sometimes we like poll some of our listeners to see what they want to ask people. And one of the questions was, when you're like, let's say you have an idea and like some other company has already built some iteration of that, right? And so like, let's say that I wanted to make something like similar. Do you know what Clubhouse is, before I keep going?
For sure. Yep.
Yeah. So like, let's say that I wanted to create something similar to Clubhouse, but like with like a new angle, going after some particular niche or something like that. But it could be any app. When you're looking at something that already exists, it could be a website, app, service, whatever, and you're trying to kind of like dissect, what do they actually use in their tech stack, right? Like, are they using AWS on the back end? Do they have, data integrations? What coding language are they built on the front end? How do you dissect like what is what's likely to be in their tech stack without being like super technical yourself? Are there tools that you might use to say, okay, this is what these people are doing, this might be a logical way of setting things up for ourselves? Or how would you approach, if you were less technical than you are, how would you approach knowing like what specific elements that your competitors or larger companies may kind of like utilize, so that you can kind of skip some of the trial and error yourself and start with like a scalable infrastructure?
Yeah, I think I would start. I think like if you're not technical yourself, then I think trying to figure out the tech stack of some other products probably maybe not the right approach, right? I think like the first thing would be to get that technical partner, to get that technical team to work with, and like you're defining what success looks like is like, hey, like I want to build this. It's going to have these features. It's going to be used in this way. It's going to have these characteristics. And if you're not technical, then like trying to dictate the technical decisions probably is going to get you in a mess. I would stay away from that.
Yeah. Just finding somebody who can actually like look it up and figure out like what these companies are using. So let's talk about Rollbar, right? So can you describe for the listeners, like what problem does Rollbar solve, and how you kind of came about and came up with that idea and started implementing it?
Yeah, so the problem Rollbar solves is at a root, it's really hard for a developer to know if your code actually works, right? And the code doesn't often work the way you want it to, right? And so there's been lots of ways people try to work around this. One is around doing lots of testing. So you say, hey, like I want to write this code. I'm going to test it locally. I'm going to like get people to QA it. I'm going to maybe run a whole bunch of automated tests. And that's useful, right? But eventually you still release it and there's still bugs in it, right? And when there's bugs in it and there's millions of people using it and there's a whole bunch of different bugs in it, it gets hard to kind of keep track of what's working and not working. That really slows developers down. And this is kind of what I experienced in those early days at Lolapps, where I was able to say, you know what, like instead of worrying about testing and getting it perfect, I'm just going to release it and like fix what I see actually broken, right? And take the approach of, hey, instead of like fix first, perfect later, just like don't worry about even trying to get perfect, just ship it and fix what you got to fix. And that problem of being able to say, hey, like what's actually broken at scale is really hard, because you're going to get like millions of errors and you don't actually have a million bugs, you have like 100 bugs. You got to prioritize them. You got to understand what code is affected and fix them. And Rollbar makes it really easy for developers to see what code's broken and to fix things really quickly.
Nice. I like that. And so for some of our younger listeners who may, want to be computer scientists or developers or whatever, if you had to identify like maybe like one or two coding languages that you think are critical today and going forward, that would be like the most useful to learn, how would you kind of go about learning how to become a developer? And then what would you focus on, knowing what you know now, to kind of give you that edge of knowing what ultimately will be or is the most useful kind of languages?
Yeah, so like conceptually, I think like development is all about building things, right? So the best way for me to learn is to have something I want to build and like figure out how to build it. And often it's easier to build by kind of like morphing rather than starting from entirely from scratch. So like there's lots of, I think like tutorials are an awesome way to learn. Kind of walking you through how to build a simple application is a great way to kind of start, and then you can tweak it and kind of build it into your own thing. From a language perspective, I think to anyone starting out, I would recommend that you look at JavaScript, because you can run it in your browser. Everyone's on the web. It's an easy way to kind of get started. And these days, it's the most popular language. And two, Python. Python's a great language for kind of all back-end server-side stuff. And it's being used for a lot of machine learning stuff. So if you want to get into learning how to use AI to build new experiences, Python is a great way to get into that.
And what do you see like going forward? Because I mean, the tech community is constantly talking about NFTs, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automations. Like, what do you see being kind of the next wave in a year from now, 2 years from now, that somebody who's 18 years old concentrating on now might have like a really significant competitive advantage, in the years to come?
I think, obviously the stuff in crypto is pretty exciting. It's pretty interesting. I think it's yet to see like kind of how that's going to turn into like things besides financial assets, but that might be all it needs. I think that the developments in machine learning are continuing to be pretty interesting. I think that, and then I think that kind of the next foray, I think it's more than a year or two out. Maybe it's more like 5 years out. Is VR and AR, right? So the kind of like each time there's a new device, whether we've gone from like a desktop to a laptop to a phone to a watch, like these are all things that have introduced new ways to build things. And I think for each generation of developers, having that new device is a pretty exciting platform.
And did you raise money for Rollbar, or did you self-fund, or how did that progression kind of happen?
Yeah, we raised a tiny bit of money when we got started. We also kind of self-funded by not paying ourselves very much for a while. We were pretty light. So we raised basically $200K to get started. We had $200K more a few months later, but that was all we raised until our Series A. So the first few years, we actually got profitable, got the business to where it was, producing enough cash to survive. And we're like, you know what, like this is working. Let's like double down and go for it. So.
Did you have like a profit share type of thing where you guys like split it, or were you paying everyone else salaries and you owned like most of the company, or how did you, or is that not public? Like, how did you structure things if that's something that you're comfortable sharing?
So early on, my co-founder and I owned most of the company. Our tight investor owned a small amount. And then we just paid salaries, right? So we paid salaries, gave employees equity, kind of standard startup type format.
Right. And then, so you raised your Series A recently, or when did that happen?
No, so Rollbar's been around for almost 9 years. So we started in 2012. We raised a Series A in 2016. And then our last round we raised was our Series B, which we raised last year.
Okay, cool. And that's all public information, right?
Yep.
The Series A and B.
Yep.
Like, so what did you raise for both of them? Did you learn anything that you might have done differently, or did you do things kind of the best way in retrospect?
I think like any fundraise that ends in the money in the bank is successful, but I think that some are easier and harder than others. I think like the more that you understand your business and the customer and the market, and the more that you have like metrics that are working, the easier it'll be. If some of those pieces are kind of a little bit murky, then it's going to be hard. And I think each of our fundraisers was kind of hard for different reasons. I think our Series A was kind of hard because we didn't quite understand how the market was gonna coalesce, and we had to find some believers who could kind of squint at it with us. And Series B was kind of hard because we were at a point where like the business is growing, but it wasn't growing like gangbusters. It was just like growing nicely. So it was like finding the right investor who wanted to invest in us at that stage.
And what do you think is like the right metrics? Like, because I mean, a lot of times people focus on, there's a million things you can track, right? But like, knowing what you know now, like what is like the kind of North Star or most important metric to you regarding like growing the business? And then what is the most important metric to your investors or investors in general regarding, business?
I think there's basically the core of it. There's two, right? There's growth and profitability. And I think I used to overvalue profitability, and I've come around to the growth camp. I think like for building anything new, and think about it this way, right? Like the thing that you're building, if you think that its potential is big, right? That like everyone in the world or like every one of your personas should be using it. So like, let's take Rollbar. There's 23 million developers in the world. There's a tiny fraction of that are using it now. And I think like long term, we want everyone to be experiencing the way that we think about software. So why would we measure ourselves on anything besides growth, right? Like we're not going to get everywhere if we're not growing fast. So I think growth has got to be that measure. I think maybe like when you've totally mature, profitability, but like if you go for profitability when you're still small, I think it's going to be really challenging to achieve that potential.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I was talking to a VC buddy, and he was like saying that being profitable is actually a negative when it comes to evaluating your company, because like the people who are investing more money, like if you're already profitable now, you don't need their money to like improve, right? It's like kind of like how he described it, which is really an interesting thought to me, because all my businesses have always kind of been profitable from day one, essentially. But like kind of changing and molding that mindset to really kind of reinvest everything aggressively into growth and caring only about growth is also an interesting idea. And something that I was reading, Pinterest head of growth, he was kind of talking about how, they don't use percentages to measure growth, because like, a 20% increase in growth, they use instead absolute numbers, right? Because like it kind of like misrepresents things when you take like a percentage of a percentage versus like, we want to grow by 1,000 absolute like new users. And so where are you mainly getting your new customers? Like, do you use paid media? Is it word of mouth primarily? Like, how are you growing?
Yeah, Rollbar it's a developer first product, right? So we want to grow by landing with a developer. We want to show them how Rollbar can change the way they work. We want them to love the product. And so that's all about finding developers, and developers hang out online in certain places. They hang out in open source kind of websites. They hang out, they listen to a lot of podcasts. So we try to be in places where developers are. And from there, it's all about proving our value and growing through kind of word of mouth across developers into companies.
I love it. So last question for you. If you could go back and talk to 18-year-old Brian, right, knowing everything that you know now, what would you say to him?
Man, the biggest thing I would say to myself is like, know yourself, figure out who you really are. And like, that matters. I think like, there's so many mistakes in my life I could have avoided by really like digging in and figuring out who I was and who I wanted to be and who I was supposed to be. And that like being successful as someone else is not worth it, right? It's much better to be successful as yourself. So that's my advice to myself.
And it's crazy because I was actually just having a conversation with one of my good friends about that yesterday, right? Because I think people kind of get like stuck up in this weird thing, thinking that there's like this one size fits all success. Like they need to be rich, they need to be famous, they need to be this or that. But what you'll find, or what I've found at least, is everyone kind of has their own unique version of success. Like Gary Vaynerchuk was talking about, like, he was like, why would I want to go skiing? Like, I don't have fun skiing. I have fun, working 18 hours a day recording content. Yeah. And some people would say, like, why would I want to work 18 hours a day when I could be skiing, right? And so the beautiful part about, the planet and who we are as people is you have to like really think about and find your own version of heaven on earth. Like, what does success mean to you? And it's really hard for people, right? Like, Charlie Munger, one of Warren Buffett's partners and mentors, talks about the law of inversion, right? That people are really bad at knowing what they like and love, but they're really good at identifying what makes them unhappy, right? So if you can identify what makes you unhappy and remove those things, right, you can kind of inadvertently or indirectly kind of find that true happiness for yourself. So if people want to find you, learn more about you, or ask you questions, maybe they're developers, they want to work with Rollbar or use it, what's the best way to contact you if you do that? Or what's the best way to learn more about Rollbar?
Yeah, so I'm at Brianer on Twitter. You can also email me. Actually, read my email. I'm brian@rollbar.com. And you can find Rollbar at rollbar.com online.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining, Brian. You're a cool guy. And if I ever need developer help, I may come to you and see if you can help us out.
I'll do my best.
All right. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, Kevin.